I'm black, you're white.
Now what? So what if I say the wrong thing?
You probably will. Who doesn't? But I'll do my best to listen.
Maybe if we're humble enough to listen to each other,
Maybe if we're brave enough to lean into those difficult conversations.
we might
We could
come up with some answers,
make some real progress
discover how much we have in common.
and appreciate our differences.
Now you're talking.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of I'm Black, You're White, Now What? I'm David Conley, communications consultant.
And I am Chris Thurber, clinical psychologist. David, it's great to see you. We've got Barbara Rancunis, who is an historian in the little old town of Exeter, New Hampshire, which I call home. So we're really excited to have Barbara with us. Before we let Barbara introduce herself and tell us how she came to become the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society and what she has uncovered about the history of both white and black people here in Exeter. We're just thinking back to the episode 21 that we did with Johan and Mazamo, our friends from South Africa.
Man, that was it was very interesting on a lot of levels, just to kind of hear their thoughts about, South Africa post apartheid and just how their educational system is trying to grapple with teaching kids about that. And it was interesting to get like a black perspective and a white perspective on that, both them being, fathers and also one way or the other in a position to educate people and young people about different things. So it was also just, I found the juxtaposition between sort of them more recently dealing with some issues that we should be beyond, you would think, but that we're still, kind of grappling with in some of the same ways. And so I found it fascinating. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it was touching to hear their perspectives as parents, as fathers in this case, and the sense of responsibility they felt they had for their young children to teach them, a full accounting that is age appropriate. But when I say full, I don't mean every fact, but every truth about the history of South Africa and, their kids having been born in post-apartheid South Africa, but still seeing many of the inequities that exist. And obviously, as we'll be talking about with Barbara Rancunis in a minute, you change a federal law or policy, the culture and the society and people's biases and prejudices don't change overnight. And I'll say for myself, I find it troubling and I guess unusually ironic that there's so much objection in the United States to taking a closer look at the fullness of our own history curriculum, US history, and the sort of, I would call it propaganda that is opposed to a more fulsome, balanced, truthful view of history gets painted as, well, we object to critical race theory, when it doesn't take much research to realize critical race theory is, an approach. And who wouldn't want a truthful, fulsome approach to anything? If you're the victim of a crime and you are hoping that the local police detective is able to find the perpetrator, you want a truthful, fulsome look at the facts, not just one side. But it seems to me like this kind of fear that
absolutely
a more complete accounting will either make people feel so bad or kids feel so bad about who they are. And I just feel like that means that maybe we're worried that teachers can't do their jobs in contextualizing historical information. But it is a complicated issue to try to overcome so many decades and centuries of bias. So
I think like a lot of communication, though, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, because I'm very interested in what Barbara has to say tonight. But I think a lot of people get emotional about a thing that then changes the narrative of that thing. So,
right,
in other
right.
words, if you're saying, "Hey, we're going to talk about history just in a more inclusive way," and your response is, "I think that will make some people feel bad," it sounds like you're suggesting that the new way that we teach this will only be about making one group of
Right.
people feel bad. When if we're going to talk about it, more in total, or bring more of it to bear, then that means we will be talking about contributions of people as well. So when you say, you may be talking about some of the things that happen to people of color in the country, but it would be just as wrong to say then that that's the only contribution that white Americans have had to American history
Right.
is somehow victimizing or enslaving people of color. That's not the only contribution, as we've learned throughout our history going forward. There are a lot of great things that have happened that have made the country great, that are contributions from everybody. And I think if we were looking more at uh, bringing some of those things in, as well as some of the pitfalls that we don't want to repeat, then I think it should make everybody feel, I would think, a little more at ease about doing it. But that's just my thought. Maybe I'm just,
I think you should stop being a filmmaker and be the new Secretary of Education. That would make me really happy.
If they would answer my emails, we may have something going. I keep sending them. But
so tonight we have Barbara Rancunis with us. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit, so our viewers and our listeners can understand your background, what it is that you do now, what you used to do, what you bring to the work that you do here in Exeter, New Hampshire. And then David and I have so many questions for you about some of the specifics that you have uncovered in your work, including, spoiler alert, the fact that there were white people who owned Black people here in New Hampshire, despite maybe people's
not in the
views
north.
that, that we're north of the Mason-Dixon line, and that slavery was a thing only characteristic of people in the South. So lots to uncover here. But let's start with a little bit of a brief bio.
Well, I currently work in the field of public history, which means that my job is to collect and interpret and care for the history of one particular place for the general public. So everything I do, really, I have a requirement to share. I work at the Exeter Historical Society. I'm the co-executive director. I began my work there as curator. My other co-executive director is Laura Martin, who does most of the technical work and a lot of the programming. Whereas my job is more working in the archives and looking at collections.
Okay.
So Exeter, New Hampshire is a fairly typical New England town. We consider ourselves old because we were organized. We've never incorporated, but we were organized in 1638, which is pretty early on if you happen to be a white person and you are from another place. If you happen to be indigenous, you know that the town goes back a long ways before that. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. There are people in this area brought here by the river systems that support our area. So the land we call Exeter has been here for a long time, with people here. So when I got the job, my background was as a high school teacher, and out of work because I had children, which, there is definitely a maternity penalty there if you don't want to
there's
put
another show there.
9 hours a daycare every day. So so I was looking for work, and I had an archaeology background as well, working up in Maine on some historic sites. So I understood how to handle artifacts and management. And part of our collections is artifacts. most of it is paper-based, but a lot of it's artifacts and a lot of photographs too. So anyway, I started here in the year 2000, so I've been there 22 years this summer.
Oh.
The collections that we have are typical of what you might find in an old colonial New England town, right? There's founding families, and everyone knows them. They go back to God, and the Gilmans, the Folsoms, and there's still a lot of people related to those families who come in. We have a lot of people who come in to do genealogy work, and I got very good at doing genealogy work. I know how to find, records on all of the white people who lived here. And, there's some tricky people. There's certain time periods when they weren't writing down who's born when and where, and that's tricky. And people just seem to spontaneously come out of nowhere. And out of all the collections, I had a thin archival box of material that was labeled African Americans. And when you run the numbers, what you discover is that Exeter was a far more diverse town in earlier times. They always say that, in earlier times. And what is meant by that is that the first enslaved Africans arrived in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth, in, I believe it's 1645. It's pretty early. Valerie Cunningham out of Portsmouth with the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail has written some really good work on that. She began to uncover people in Portsmouth. When I say uncover, it's because it is hard to find people. And there's the research for that is quite different from everything that I was used to. So I had been left this thin file of collections of accounts of Exeter's Black people as written by Exeter's white people. And most of these accounts were written in the later parts of the 19th century. And they all had a kind of a minstrel show-like air to them. They would quote Exeter's Black population speaking in a dialect as though they were from the plantation South, which can't possibly be true. So after some, soul searching and some upheavals in the national politics, realized that we need to find more about people who lived here. I mean, we have to do Exeter's history. We have to do all of Exeter's history. And the real goal was to find documentation for who was living here, where these folks were living, and find their own words if possible, which is the harder part. Recently, I've also been following kind of not really a plot line, but when you do history, everything becomes a story, everything, even your own grandparents, it all becomes kind of a story. So you get involved in storytelling a lot and then realize I'm talking about real people here. And when I walk around town, I'm walking in a haze because in my mind, I am seeing people in places that are not there now. So when I walk down a certain street, there are, in my head, I am reminded of the people who I know who lived there and what has occurred there. So that's one of the pitfalls of being a historian is you always have one foot in the past, and sometimes you have to shake yourself forward and remember, nope, this is right now. This is right now. So
it's fascinating. I mean,
my kids harass me about that. I'm a time traveler in my mind, and I have to stop doing that. But it's really terrible.
Oh, I mean, people needed chemicals to do that in the 1960s. So if you can do it just walking down the street.
A couple of years ago, I got obsessed with whaling simply because I was listening to Backstory, the podcast, and they were talking about whaling. I was taking a shower that morning, and I all of a sudden realized that my house was built in 1775, and for a good chunk of the time that it existed, it was completely lit by whale oil.
Oh,
and,
yeah. Right.
And that just set me right off. And I went into work, and I have a team of volunteers who, thank the good Lord, don't ask me for why I'm asking them these weird questions. But I went in that day and said, what are we working on today? And I said, I need you to go down to the newspaper morgue, which is the basement where we keep the old newspapers, and find out in the 1830s and 40s where you could buy whale oil in Exeter. Find the ads and then come back. And then like 2 hours later, they come upstairs from being in the basement and they tell me where they could find whale oil. And then only then say, why did you need that? I'm like, oh, I needed to know where the people in my house went to get whale oil. So that's the kind of thing that can happen to you. So when considering Exeter's Black population, which was nearly a fifth of the population, well, not a fifth, nearly 5% of the population just after the American Revolution, There was
Okay.
some reason people came to Exeter. And you have to start with the understanding that there were enslaved people who lived in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a super white state.
Yeah,
And
we're like 93, 94% white
oh yeah.
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still really high. And so I think, I went to school in Maine, and in Maine, we kind of learned history as slavery was a bad thing that happened in the South,
Yep.
that people fought a war because they wanted to keep slavery, and we were the good guys because we didn't have it up here. And then we would look around our completely white classroom and say, we still don't, but we're good. We're still okay, and that's, it's really a mixed up way of teaching things, because it denies people's history correctly. And that, I can't tolerate that. I can't tolerate not knowing the history of everybody in the town of Exeter.
What's fascinating
So,
to me, just before we go on, that when you got there to the Exeter Historical Society 22 years ago to start your work, there was such a tiny volume of information about the people of African descent who lived in this area. Number one. Number two, it was written by white people. Number three,
Mhm.
that writing mischaracterized people. And number four, there wasn't the kind of documentation. You had fancy genealogies and birth records and probably, baptism records and things like that from the prominent white families in the area in the, as you said, 1640s or late 1630s, when the town was, what did you say? Not incorporated, but organized. That, there's so much evidence of the separation of classes simply in those factors, in who was doing the writing, the amount of writing, what was written, and what you were able to find. And I feel like it's, as you said, and then I'll let you go on. It is that in itself, to a non-historian, me, so revealing about what was going on, and how Black people and white people had very different privileges, and the ways in which, well, whoever, if they were Black and they had a baby, or they, it wasn't a thing to be recorded. And that is, it's a frightening thought, but as you pointed out, nothing like that is ever taught. And I also went to public school in South Portland, Maine, and got the same sort of incomplete, whitewashed version of, say, the Civil War, for example. But please go on.
well, I was across the bay from you in Falmouth, so
okay,
we were practically neighbors. Right. And so in trying to research people, it could be difficult, because first of all, even knowing the names of people makes it hard. You need to know the person's name. That's where you start. Okay.
Right.
So how do you find a person's name? So in a population that was very much marginalized, the only way you can locate people is by looking on the margins. So we're not going to find baptismal records much. We're not going to find birth records. Birth records were all over the place anyway in New Hampshire. You didn't have to register your child's birth. So there's this dead zone, like from the 1790s till the 1820s. If there wasn't a doctor in town that just happened to be listing off all the babies he delivered, then you're not going to get those folks. Marriages were a lot looser back then, so they weren't necessarily written down anywhere. And the other problem is, if a person was enslaved, they may not have any kind of surname, or even if they did have a surname, it is ignored. So, for instance, I think it's either 1800 or 1810 census, they would list all of the people of color at the very end of the census. Okay, so let's talk about marginalization first, there at the end. And then on one of those two censuses, I'm sorry, I can't recall which one, they only list their first names. So we're trying to track a family, and we're trying to figure out who the family members are and who is living within that family. They're only listing the head of household, and they're only going to give you one name. So it will say Caesar. Now, there's certain naming practices that were used in, especially in New England, for enslaved people. So they're named by white people. And so their first names tended to be a certain, you can recognize them right off. They're Pompey, Caesar. They used a lot of names from classical literature. They thought it was kind of funny that that people of African descent who had lost their real names come over here, and then they thought it was funny to give them a noble name to somebody whose social status was at the very bottom. So you see those names over and over again. There are many people. There are a lot of women named Dinah, or shortened to Di. Where do we find their names? If it's not in the census and it's only the head of household, so they may have 8 family members and you have no idea who they are. Are these children or adults? But there's also the problem of just trying to locate where people are. And, we'll find them in odd places. We'll be reading the will of someone. And as an aside, after talking about who was going to get the real estate and who was going to get the horses, all of a sudden there's a note that, my 2 colored servants is code in New England for slave. I'm going to give their services to my brother. So I located one of those. I was doing research on an epidemic called the throat distemper of 1735, which was a form of virulent diphtheria that came through the area. And one of the key figures in it was a minister in Kingston, New Hampshire. And his whole family dies of this horrible thing. And he comes back to Exeter, where he was from in the first place. And it isn't until I'm reading he's got his tombstone is in the Congregational churchyard. So you think of this man as sort of a tragic hero who fought this horrible disease and saw so many people die, and what a sad life he had. And then you read his will and find out he had several enslaved people who he doesn't seem to care about at all. And you think to yourself, they also went through that. Right. They went through that epidemic. And the minister's role in it cannot be undervalued. He was there to provide comfort, but in a way, he also brought that disease from family to family to family, as they called him from one household to another to visit the children. So one of those people was probably his driver, and the other one was it was a couple. The other was an enslaved woman who was caring for his household as his family was dying of the same disease. So they went through it as well, and somehow they survived as he did. And I don't even know their names. He did not list their names in his will. And so trying to find out what happened to them after this man's death is difficult and frustrating, because I would like to know their story from their point of view.
When I hear this, I'm sorry, just right quick before, when I hear this, I'm reminded we had a conversation, Chris, early on, you and I, about the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter statements. And it's this kind of thing that is very difficult to articulate to people who say, well, all lives matter, because then you try to say, yeah, but if you know what you're talking about historically, that has not been the case. Like, even the only people who were thought worthy of being documented were, these were the white people, but the like you said, the Black people who were also going through some of the same things, and then in some cases, more challenging things. Definitely, they're not even recorded. It's like historically they almost don't exist were it not for somebody like Barbara here. So I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure that I said that before we got off.
It's such a good point. And it's something that when we did have that conversation, I didn't understand the objection, maybe 3 years ago, to saying all lives matter. I did understand that the emphasis was on Black lives being devalued for centuries. What I didn't understand was the implication, and this is where I think we've tried, you and I, David, with our guests, to shine a light on some of the shadowy nuances of, as you so often point out, the nuances of concepts that are easily misunderstood and therefore mischaracterized and used to perpetuate people's anger or stereotypes or something, or just say, no, I will dismiss this whole idea because of this mischaracterization, when what we really want to say is time out. Before you dismiss it, let's understand it. And what I guess I didn't understand, that when somebody said, well, don't all lives matter, all lives matter, that the subtext is, and it's clear to me now, and especially Barbara, with the explanation that you just gave, just how important it is to, especially for a white person, to understand, if you say all lives matter, it is, on the surface, a true factual statement, but in the context of social justice, it is, the subtext is, and they always have, when that's not the case. And I when I don't know where to start sometimes with people who object to revising, updating, enlarging, and making more complete history curricula, because they simply say, well, like you said, David, they're focusing on the word critical in the phrase critical race theory, and without just saying, well, okay, that's a theory that can drive our revision of this curriculum. They get lost in misunderstandings. And I'm sharing with our audience that I myself have gotten lost in misunderstanding. So I'm not being judgmental in, I hope, in some sort of arrogant way, like, well, I've always understood this, but those poor people who don't understand, too bad for them. No, like this is, I feel like this is the cutting edge of what we should be doing more of, is like understanding some of these nuances. So like, Barbara, I saw advertised maybe last week on Netflix, series on the Underground Railroad. And when I first had a preliminary conversation with you and said, hey, would you be a guest on our show, it was because I had thought, even before I saw the trailer for this Underground Railroad series, that I'd heard whispers here and there of maybe there had been some role that Exeter played in helping enslaved Black people escape to the North from the South at some point. And you set me straight and said, well, that might make some people feel good, but it never happened. Not in Exeter. Exeter doesn't have a part in that we know of.
That we know of. We haven't found any evidence. The
So,
Underground Railroad is tricky because I think there's a lot of white people want to be the hero of the Underground Railroad. So everybody wants their house to be a station on the Underground Railroad. So starting in the 50s and 60s, anybody who had a hidden room in their house immediately leaped to the conclusion that, this was the Underground Railroad. And we have a house that's next door to us that is, I would say, 1/32 of a mile away from the river. And the story in Exeter was that this house, which does in fact have kind of a room behind a room, because that's the construction, it has built-in bookcases and such. And the story was that there was a tunnel from this house to the river, so that somehow magically people would arrive in town. I don't know how they got here. And then they would hide in this house, and then they would be sneaked down to the river, where they would be spirited away to freedom. And I mean, there's no streetlights back at that time period. You could just, it's dark. You just run
you don't
down
need
the
a
river if you
tunnel
were going to
that's
go.
500
I mean,
yards
you don't
long,
need a tunnel. And Chris, as you probably know, all of our underground anything in this neighborhood we have springs that go right through
it's
there.
water.
So
You're
keeping
not going to go.
tunnel would have been extremely difficult, and everybody would have known about it because you'd have to build it. So, yeah, I have never found any evidence that the Underground Railroad came anywhere near Exeter. People who were escaping on the Underground Railroad frequently took what we would consider to be almost public transportation. They hid on boats, they came on trains, they did run through the woods occasionally, and they were helped by one another more than a lot of white people. There were white people involved. I mean, we're not going to, we don't be too short-sighted here, but it's not as, it's probably not as organized. And it was also a very short time period when that was happening. So we really don't have any evidence. I don't have any
Okay.
accounts in Exeter, no police reports, no fugitive slaves that were trapped in town, nothing like that happening. So I just don't have any evidence. So
Can you tell us about
my stand is probably not.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Until
Probably not. Unlikely.
yeah, it's until we have some evidence, but for now, no. And it's again, it very revealing. And once again, I'll point out that I'm, talking about myself as well. That hey, that was my first question to you again before I saw this trailer. Like, Barbara, this is what I heard. Of course, hoping that there was something interesting and redeeming about white people who were here in 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Alas, and it's, as you said, and as David said, it is a mixed bag of what we would look upon now and say, that was just, that was unjust. You did tell me about a couple of individuals, as challenging as it is, given the dearth of records, the same detail that white people kept of themselves. But can you tell us about the two individuals that who of African descent that you have learned about, and I think not just their names and whatever else about their identities, but something about their lives, and people I think would be fascinated to know how you came across this information, because as you have pointed out, there isn't nearly as much for all the reasons that we talked about. But tell us about those two people.
Well, we'll start by saying that after the American Revolution and the American fighting forces was probably the most integrated fighting force that the United States had until probably the Korean conflict. So if a man was enslaved and got permission, he could serve in the American forces. And if he served a certain amount of time, he would be given his freedom. So in New Hampshire, a lot of people took advantage of that or managed to do that.
And you said we're talking about the Revolutionary War.
We're talking about the Revolutionary War, right? They could give their freedom. They could also get their freedom if they served for the British. So let's not forget that too.
Really?
Yeah, the British forces would offer the same thing, and they'd offer them land. And after the war, they got land, and it was in all the worst parts of Canada. So it didn't really work out that well. So we'll take it as an example. And there's quite a few men who settled after the war in Exeter. They're from the surrounding towns, but they settle in Exeter. And the frustrating part for a researcher is that we know that they served in the war, and we know more about them after the war, but we don't really know where they came from. So Jude Hall was a man who was enslaved in Kensington. And another note to have is that people who were enslaved in New Hampshire don't always have the same naming pattern. So the name Hall, we have no idea where he gets his surname. The two owners that we know of are not named Hall. One was named Blake, and I can't remember the other one off the top of my head right now, but of the two owners he had that we know of, neither one of them was named Hall. So we don't know where he gets his name from. I don't know anything about his background other than he came from Kensington. And so he plops into my historical record as a full-grown person, signing documents. He was literate, signing documents to join the American forces. We know that his previous owner had sold him to a man he didn't particularly care for, and we don't know the story here, whether he ran away to join the military, which is doubtful because he joined right here. You would go far if you were trying to escape. But he could have, or he could have cut a deal with the person who owned him body and soul and said, I will serve if you don't have to. That's a possibility. We don't really know. So we don't know much. I don't know his parents. I don't know how they were
Mm.
enslaved. I don't know where they were from. I know nothing about his background. He serves in the American Revolution, and he is there from Bunker Hill right through to the end. He serves throughout the entire war. I think it's like 8 years. And after the war, he is given his freedom. He comes back to this area. Kensington is the town right next to Exeter.
Mhm.
He marries another woman of color from the area. She is actually biracial. Her mother, this is one of Caesar Paul's children, Rhoda, and her mother was white, her father was black. And so he marries her, and together they have 8 children. He eventually winds up living on a parcel of land that is given to him, but I think it's only the use of it because I cannot find a deed. And he and Rhoda have 8 children, 4 girls, 4 boys.
Hmm.
Now he has served in the American Revolution, right, to earn his freedom, his own freedom, and the greater country's freedom. His wife is a free woman from birth. All of his children are born free in the town of Exeter. None of their births are registered. His marriage is not registered anywhere. We know this because, as again, try to find their voices. He applies for a pension. They were Revolutionary War soldiers were eligible for a pension in 1818. So by then he's older at this point in time. And in his pension application is when we start to get a better picture of what his life was like after the revolution. He states that his marriage was never registered. His children's births were never registered. After his death, when Rhoda applies for his widow's pension, she has to state that again. They need to get affidavits from people in town stating that they lived as a married couple. I mean, they're together since like 1790 something, and they have 8 children together, and yet they have to have people testify that they are married. And then Rhoda says straight out that they cannot find his discharge papers. So they go back and they find his commanding officers at various times, and they have to write, these are all white people, of course, are writing affidavits saying, yes, I recall Jude Hall. So he is a free man from then on. There's no paperwork. There's no manumission papers. There's nothing stating you are born free. Why would you have that? No white person would ever consider needing something like that. Certainly, if you were of African descent, you don't have it either. So of his 8 children, he has 3 sons. And there's limited things that you could do for a living if you're living in New England and you are of African descent. It's hard to get into the trades. And so Jude spent the rest of his life doing what we would consider to be day labor. So he assists in various things. He helps people if they're clearing land. He helps people haul things. He lives out on a pond that is now called Jude's Pond, where he could fish and perhaps sold the fish. He's living in a 2-room cabin, so he's probably just barely feeding his family. But he's trustworthy enough that when there is a murder trial and he is somewhat involved in helping out the victim, he actually testifies. And because we have the testimony records, we can hear his voice. And what he does not sound like is a Southern plantation person. He sounds very New England, which is not surprising. He was born and raised here. Of his 3 sons, 3 of them wind up enslaved during their time period. With limited ability to earn a living, many young Black men found themselves going to sea, working as mariners in various trades. And 3 of Jude Hall's sons did that. The embarkation point for here was usually Newburyport, Massachusetts. So we have accounts of what happened. One of his sons, Aaron, is on a ship and it goes to the West Indies, and he is never heard from again. And word gets back to the family that he was somehow enslaved, and they never find him again. We don't know what happened to him. Another son, William, also ships out to the West Indies, gets captured there and enslaved for, they say 10 years. We don't really know because it all hinges on his mother got a letter from him years later, but we don't have the letter. So I don't know exactly what it says, but the account of it is that his mother received a letter after his father's death. And he said that he was enslaved in the West Indies for 10 years and then escaped to England, where he worked on a collier ship between, I think it's Liverpool and London, and he was captaining the ship. So he never comes back to Exeter. He does get word back to his mother that he is living. And I would love to track him and find his life in England and find out, did he have family? What did he do after that? My tentative attempts to do this through the British archives has not been helpful because his name is William Hall, which is a very common name, as you can imagine, and with no designation of what your race is on something like a census record over there, we have no way of knowing who is the William Hall from Exeter. So we would like to track him down. We could do it through DNA. I need Henry Louis Gates to help me out on this.
And just as an aside, what would they have been? Would it have been like sugarcane plantations in the West Indies?
Yeah, the West Indies. You know, the pandemic has allowed me to do things I never thought I could, and I got to take an online course through the University of Edinburgh about the Atlantic slave trade from the British perspective. And the cruelty of the West Indies is absolutely appalling. People were brought there just to work through their lives, their short lives. So they're kidnapped from their homes on the west coast of Africa and brought to the West Indies. The West Indies was completely converted into sugar plantations. They couldn't even grow their own food there. So food is imported from places like New England. A lot of the cod that we packed away was sent to the West Indies to feed enslaved people who were simply working their lives to death. And there was no thought of them even reproducing. You know how in the American South, they always talk about how, well, once the slave trade is stopped, then you have to depend on natural reproduction to have more enslaved people, that women will produce more children and that will be your next generation of enslaved people. But in the West Indies, they simply just worked people to death. It was horrific. So, if Jude Hall's family ties go to the West Indies, then they are definitely survivors. But more than likely, the one son, Aaron, probably perished there. And
Aaron and William would have come on a ship, let's say, as you said, maybe from Newburyport, Massachusetts, maybe, and this was a job. They were going to take a job as a sailor, perhaps bringing salted cod down to the West Indies. And as you said, born free, they have a job, and like, I presume an expectation that I don't know, what they must have been, I was going to say an expectation that they would have stayed free. Somebody must have not told them where they were going. Because at the very least,
they would have known they were going to the West Indies, I'm sure, because they usually would know where the ships were going to go. But I don't think their expectation was that they may have known they were in terrible danger. But it happened that people could be just kidnapped off the ship, and that kind of thing happened anyway, and that's why we got involved.
But the other thing
the War
is,
of 1812 was the impressment of soldiers, sailors, right? So we know that happens.
Yeah. Even in country though, as far as the U.S., I mean, you're as free as the grace of white people.
Yes, if they'll allow you to see.
You know what I mean? Like, you can have your papers and you can have but you're free, and that's another thing I'm saying that's a nuance, if you will, that's rarely understood, is that your freedom is not as cemented as other people. Your freedom is tenuous.
Well, and that's
and so
right. That's a lot of what's behind the talk, right?
It's going to depend on who knew you.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what it would come down to sometimes, is who knew you. Their other son, James, was only 18 when he also decided he was going to set out to sea, and he signed on to be a cook. And when the ship got to Alexandria, there's a difference of opinion as to what happened in Alexandria. Rhoda Hall always felt that the ship's captain, Isaac Stone, sold him into slavery there. That's what she thought happened, and she testified to that. So we have her words. Again, we have her words in an affidavit, not testimony, but in an affidavit.
And that was the other thing I was going to say, is some of your freedom depends on whether you become currency. You know what I mean?
Right. He may have been very valuable to sell. Stone comes back and says, no, he deserted. He was a bad sailor. And he claimed that he deserted in Alexandria. He never saw him again. He thought he got off the ship and got drunk, and they never saw him again. So difference of opinion there. Other people later spotted him in New Orleans, and they said that he had been enslaved on a plantation in, I think it's Kentucky, and he was owned by a man who was he was French man who was a doctor. It's another, like I said, we need Henry Louis Gates. I need to find out what happened to James. Um, so, those stories just kind of pinpoint to you how insecure freedom could be, even in the North.
Yeah.
The other story I was telling Chris about on this quick phone call that we had was a man who lived on the other side of our neighborhood, whose name was Henry Mainjoy. Henry Mainjoy was considered whenever they write an obituary, they will say he was a solid citizen, very well respectable man. That's kind of a backhanded compliment, as if the assumption would be that he wasn't, but here he was. So they like to give you the notable. Henry Mainjoy was born in near Senegal in Africa, on the west coast of Africa, and when he was about 9 or 10 years old, he is kidnapped. And he gives an account of this in the 1870s, which is after the point of time where you hear a lot of slave narratives, because those come through during the abolitionist time period. But before you start getting too much of a romanticization of the old plantation South, which happens a little later. So he's right in between those two time periods. And he's probably speaking to John Templeton, who was the editor of the Exeter newsletter, also a neighbor because he lived in my house. And the account he gives, it starts out sounding very much that it is Henry Mainjoy's words. And he recalls that he was about 10 years old and he was living with his family in a small village. And his parents had always warned the boys to be careful because there were slavers in the area who would kidnap them and they'd never see him again. And he remembers the day he was out playing with his friends. So he was with a group. And they were surprised from the woods, and some men came out with guns, and the other boys managed to run away, and he didn't make it out so fast. And then he's marched about 2 weeks to, he says, Senegal itself, so it's a city there. And he was kept in this dreary, horrible place. And then the story kind of takes a turn, because from there, and he recalls his childhood. He tells Templeton all about the childhood, about how he lived with his family, and they primarily were they herded cattle, but they also ate a lot of fruits and vegetables that he recalled, and it was a pleasant life. He didn't have to wear much clothing, which for some reason John Templeton thought was amusing, but I mean, it was warm there. He wouldn't have needed to.
Yeah.
And he recalled his parents. And so then he's in this, he's entrapped in this enclosure. And then a man comes in, a white man, one of the first he had ever seen, and he purchased him for $25. That's what Henry Mainjoy remembers. He's purchased for $25. And Templeton says, and from here, he was a very lucky boy, because he was purchased by Noah Emery of Exeter, New Hampshire, who after a sailing voyage brought him here. And here he learned all of the wonderful things that America could offer him. He learns to read and write, and he is, civilized. And that happens in 1809. That's when he is brought to America. We're still trying to track down the shipping records that are going to show that. We're narrowing it down. But that's probably a true date, not just because Henry Mainjoy himself remembers it, but because later when he applies for his U.S. citizenship, the son of Noah Emery recalls the same date. That's his testimony. He says, yes, this is Henry Mainjoy. He is from Senegal, and he was brought here by my father in 1809. Now, here's the problem with this whole story. If he was purchased for $25 and it is 1809, it is illegal to bring enslaved people into the United States at that point. And it's not because it's some sort of state law. It is in the US Constitution that the slave trade would end in, I think it's 1806, 1807. So this is seriously illegal. So throughout his life, he seems to have been reminded and told that he is not enslaved. But was he really a free man? I mean, Noah Emery purchases him for $25, and he doesn't bring him back to the child's parents, who were probably grateful, would have been grateful to have him back. No, he kidnaps him and takes him across the ocean. So, kidnapping, yes, he was kidnapped by slave traders, and then he was trafficked by Noah Emery. The story gets weirder, though, because he lives with Emery until he's 21, when Emery dies. He does learn to read and write. He does have the advantages that they talk about
And I'm sorry,
so to
would he have
speak.
learned from, would it have been Emery or a family member who would have taught him, or?
More likely, he went to Exeter public schools,
Okay.
which were known to have to not be too. They were always integrated. Yeah, Exeter public schools were always
Okay.
integrated because Charles Tash's whole family goes to the Exeter public schools, and his father and the Cutlers, they all make sure that their kids go to the public schools.
Oh, so the Hall
So
children would have also gone to Exeter
right,
Public.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and the little girl that Cabria Baumgartner is trying to study, Rosetta Morrison, who lived up the street as well. She was clearly educated because she goes on to to become a teacher. So we're just trying to track down, did the family teach her or did she go to public schools? But they had the opportunity, and there was a school right up the street on Park Street. So more than likely he went to school there. He is mostly known as Harry Emery during his childhood. Okay. And after Noah Emery dies, Henry is then given his time. In other words, he is allowed to be an adult. Now, that was the legal age anyway, at about the age of 21, when a boy was considered legally free from his father's household anyway, even with white kids. That's when most apprenticeships ended. So the age of 21 is kind of a magical time. And it just happened that Henry happens to get to that age just at the same time that the person who brought him over from Africa has died. So he marries another, a woman from Portsmouth, and they have children together. And we couldn't find listings for the children for the longest time, looking through birth records, until we looked at the records of Dr. William Perry, and he writes the children's births down and gives their last name as Emery. So he lists the parents as being Harry and Phyllis Emery. And so we're looking at this going, what? And Harry then names his first two sons. He names one of them Noah E, and the second one he names John E, middle initial E. I don't know what it is, but it's probably Emery, because he changes his family name to Mainjoy, which he spells Mainjoy, in spite of the fact that townspeople are referring to him as Emery as his last name. He uses Mainjoy. This is a name I haven't been able to track anywhere. When I looked through census records to find out where the name Mainjoy comes from, I can't find it. And sometimes in Exeter, it's written as Manjoy, Manjoy, but I have his signature, and he wrote it as Mainjoy, Mainjoy. So he names his first two sons after the man who brought him here from Senegal and that man's eldest son, John.
Wow.
He has to apply for citizenship in 1848. Now, remember, his legal status is that he is considered a free person, but he wasn't really free because he's brought here and he is in the household of Noah Emery. Was he a servant? Was he treated like the other children? We just don't know what his legal status was at that point. And he is from another country. So in 1848, he applies to the state of New Hampshire for naturalization so that he can become a U.S. citizen, because he isn't even a U.S. citizen. And in that record, which I found up at the state archives, he has affidavits, one from John Emery, who recalls and relates the story about how his father brought him over from far away in Africa. And he even says 1809. I'm like, you're ratting out your dad. He's breaking the law here. But I think it was important to Henry Mainjoy to get that. And he becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1848, which is quite interesting because later the Dred Scott decision would state for the record that Black people are not citizens at all. And here's Henry Mainjoy, who finally has a piece of paper. And I wonder if that had something to do with it. He does this before that particular ruling comes down. The fugitive slave law is about to be passed. He was probably concerned about that and needed some sort of documentation of who he was and why he was here. He makes sure that in his citizenship application, he uses the name Mainjoy. All of his children are later named Mainjoy. Two of them serve in the American Civil War in the Navy. He has one who goes to sea and becomes a whaler. the first whaler I managed to find in Exeter. Remember, I told you I had a thing about whaling.
Yeah.
That's one of the sons. And his granddaughter, who goes to the Robinson Female Seminary, which was our sort of fancy girls' school, becomes a teacher and cannot teach in New Hampshire, in Exeter anyway, because there's no Black teachers in Exeter. So she left. And she goes down and eventually winds
Educated
up
in Exeter, but
yeah,
they wouldn't let her teach.
This is Henry Mainjoy's granddaughter. Her name was Medora Bailey. And you see a name like Medora Bailey, that does not sound like a Black name. So we can't even find people like the Robinson Seminary. We didn't realize she was there because they don't write down a person's race, which, yes, good for them, but not so helpful for us. There are times we need people to be just a little bit racist so that we can find their records. But that was not one of the times. Yeah. So Medora Bailey winds up, she marries a man named William Jason, who is the first principal of the University of Delaware, or Delaware State, excuse me, which is a historically Black college. And she teaches there as well, from Exeter, New Hampshire, and but she couldn't teach here. She winds up teaching at a Black university, which is great for them. Not so great for us. So that's digging amazing. Out our history to find people can be tricky because the trail grows cold and because we have to look for these oddities within our history. So Henry Mainjoy is a complex person. He was a complex person. He seems both grateful for having come to New Hampshire, but you wonder what his life was like, without his parents and his family that he never saw again, probably never communicated with again.
And there were never any consequences for
never any consequences.
Noah Emery.
No, of course not. In fact, he's almost viewed as the white savior for having brought Henry Mainjoy here.
Wow.
And you wonder why he names his children for the family that brought him here. So it's a complicated story.
Right.
We don't know exactly what motivates people to do the things they do, but a lot of it kind of goes around what is it to be free, at that time period. Who's free and who isn't?
Yeah. Because your marital status, your citizenship, your employment, your birth, all could be called into question. And as David said earlier, and you've given us some examples of, all very capricious, all at the whim of the nearest white person who could testify for or against you or provide an affidavit about your status. And David has done some amazing work on this question of status, and we do workshops together that call people's attention to that, and how they, in contemporary society, are treating people with higher or lower status equal to theirs or not equal to theirs. And it just, so much of your narrative, Barbara, and I'm so grateful for the detail, much of which, as you said, is missing, but much of which you have also been able to find enough to start to give us a picture of the starkly different status that people of African descent had in Exeter. And as you said, it cuts right to the pith of, what do you mean free? I don't think I'll ever think about that word the same way after this.
I'm curious too, just so when you took over, or when you started working with this organization 22 years ago or what have you, and you said there was a small volume, would you say the reason was the status assignments to that group of people, or just the daunting task of doing what you're doing, looking up you know what I mean, these things and having
Mm.
to dig them up, because I would imagine that that can be a thing that, you know, might make a person say, well, I don't know about that, just because of the amount of work that it would take to unearth and find some of these things. Do you know what I mean? That would be much more difficult than what you normally would have to, you know, to deal with. So
Yeah, it was
I'm
not for
thinking,
want of
yeah.
trying. I mean, they had given it, you know, they gave it some try. The difference is that we have access to more records now,
Mm.
Hmm.
because there was no internet,
Yeah, sure.
you know, before 2000. And simply being able to go through records on something like Ancestry or Family Search, um, and then being able to access what is available. It's all about finding aids in many ways.
Mm.
Hmm.
What documents can you find that will help you do this? Now, we've been going through the shipping records out of Salem, Massachusetts, to try and find out when Noah Emery's ships came and went, specifically in the year that he would have brought Harry in, because they have to list every single person on the manifest. So as soon as we can find out that exact time and date, they do have a cook on board whose name is Harry, and they do refer to Henry as Harry a lot. So I have a feeling he gets named for the cook, but we shall see. Finding records is always the trick. And, you know, I think that my predecessors just didn't have access to a lot of the records that we can find today. I had an intern over the summer last summer, and we went up to the state archives and we went through the pauper records just to find out when many people, when they entered the, you know, they needed assistance from the town, and they went into any kind of protective custody in a way, you know, you either have to live with in the pauper house or on the town farm. They had to give a deposition as to why they were poor. And in it, they would have to list who their parents were. Remember, I said that people just drop out of nowhere and I can never find their family. And suddenly these pauper records would tell us, you know, somebody would talk about where they were from and who their parents were and how they came to be where they are. And they'd have to say that their parents didn't have any money either, or they wouldn't be able to get in. So it was like we were reading some of the words of these people. So there was a woman named Hannah Blossom who was from Exeter. She had been married in Exeter and had a husband who was off at sea, and he kind of deserted her. And she later has a child outside of that marriage. And this little boy grows up most of the time in the poorhouse. When he gets to be about 7 years old, the overseers of the poor decide that they're going to apprentice him out, right? Teach him a trade. So apprentice him out to someone, a farmer or a weaver or someone. And they do this. And then within a few weeks or months, they discover that his plan, the person they've apprenticed him to, has planned to sell him into slavery in the South. And they catch him. His name was Noah Rollins. And they go to court, and the boy is returned to his mother, still at the poorhouse. And he has a rough life later on. They try to apprentice him and teach him the barbering trade to become a barber in, I think, Concord or Manchester, another city. And that fails as well. But to think that he almost lost his tenuous hold on freedom, very tenuous. I mean, he's in town care already, and they have control over his life already. Instead of his mother having control over his life, she's had to yield that over simply out of poverty because she couldn't support herself. So there's all different levels of what is a free person and what is not. Whatever happened to Benjamin Sweat, I don't know. I really don't know. We're still looking.
David, I'm sure you have a closing question or comment. If I could offer a penultimate question, since we're nearly out of time. I'm just curious, Barbara, from a very personal point of view, how has your research changed your sense of racism or race relations in the United States? What perspective has it given you about what we have accomplished and not accomplished in, you know, the last 400 years?
That's frustrating, the things that we haven't accomplished.
Yeah.
Accepting one another with full citizenship and full rights is still challenging. You know, assumptions are made, and you like to think you're not racist, but you are.
Mm.
That's always a reality that hits home no matter what you're reading. Yeah, that's a tough question. Where do you go from that? It makes me realize how, my family came over. They were part of the great immigration wave of the early 20th century. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores. But quite frankly, they may have wanted opportunity, economic opportunity, but these were not people who were at the bottom of the barrel. They didn't come here out of desperation. They came out here because they wanted a new life, and they just waltzed right in. And even the family, Lithuanians and the Germans who didn't speak English when they got here, within one generation, they're blending right in with all of the same opportunities that a lot of other people had. It becomes more of a class system than a racial issue. And I think about that, which I've always thought of this great American story. And you realize that was not difficult for them. They were able to do that. They had opportunities simply because of the color of their skin. And they could live wherever they wanted. All of these options that were open to them. Mm-hmm. Within 3 generations, they had college graduates. Yeah. None of that was available back then. Or it would have limitations placed on it. Henry Mainjoy's granddaughter may have done quite well. But there were limitations placed on her. She could only find work in certain places. She had to raise her children in a different part of the country. By the way, she named her youngest child Henry Mainjoy Jason. To her grandfather, using his name.
Thank you for that answer.
When I think about the young men who went on the ship to the West Indies, I am sort of eerily also reminded of some of the things you hear about the prison industrial complex and all the things that have happened with that post slavery, and how if you don't have that experience or the possibility of that experience, it's easy for you to then dismiss it all, as well, that was then, this is now, et cetera. But in one form or another, the needs or lusts that made a captain sell a sailor into slavery, or possibly 3 or more, is still exists. So as long as those things still exist, people in power or people with privilege will find and can find a way to exploit the people who don't have that privilege. Mm-hmm. And I think when we start talking about a lot of these race issues, that's an easy thing to want to forget. I mean, shucks, I want to forget it, but I cannot. I'd be irresponsible as a man for myself, for any of my brothers and sisters, and for my son and daughter too, to make sure that you don't forget that that's still a possibility. Sadly, not that it will be necessarily slavery in the same exact way, but do you know what I mean? The dangers of you losing rights and freedoms, or those things being chipped away, stripped away, whatever, still exists. A lot of what they're trying to do with the voting here in Georgia is exactly that, and so you just then in that sense, people in this country, we are not afforded the ability to say that was then, this is now, get over it, and so I applaud you so much for the stuff you're doing, and I know it doesn't even remotely sound easy, and so really kudos to you and your team for doing it and for giving these people a voice who's, had none then, it seems, and what voice they did have, time and people who didn't think that their lives matter, would have tried to snuff out or bury. But for people like you, so thank you so much for all your insights and for putting a lot of things on my mind. I'm sure on Chris's mind and hopefully our viewers' minds too. So
Indeed. And I hope, Barbara, that you'll come back and be our guest again, because there's so much more to talk about. But I'm like David, I'm so moved by the particulars, and it has changed how I think about the broader issues of, as you said, Barbara, what it means to be free, or as David said, status and privilege. And it shines an embarrassing light on my own ignorance about what I have conveniently not known. And that's where I feel this moral imperative for our country to not be so complacent and not, we're better than a partial history for the sake of convenience or brevity or preserving somebody's good mood. You can't study the Holocaust without being traumatized. You can't study the history of this country, whether you're talking about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the War of 1812, or anything in between. You just can't do it without there being some discomfort. And we're doing a huge disservice to ourselves as a society if we prioritize comfort over truth. So please do come join us again.
I'll be happy to.
You're doing important work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to I'm Black, You're White, Now What?
You can find more episodes on the podcast channel Teaching What It Takes, available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
To learn more about the work I do, visit www.preparingthepath.com.
And to learn more about the work I do, visit drchristhurber.com.